Hi YouTube, welcome to the second episode of Pimp My Deck. Today we've got one of my favorites, and that is Jegantha the Wellspring. This is a 5 CMC 5/5 legendary creature from Ikoria. It is a 5 color commander. It has companion, but we are going to be building it as the commander today. And it says tap, add white, blue, black, red, green to your mana pool. This mana can't be spent to pay generic costs. So we can only use that mana to pay the colored icons in costs of cards that we want to cast. Despite the restriction on not being able to pay generic costs, this card can generate insane amounts of mana, insane amounts of value, and really can snowball the game if we use it with the right synergies. So today I want to go through some of those synergies, some incredibly strong cards in the deck, and how we're going to best utilize this card. So the first thing I want to highlight is just that we are going for a mutate theme. Mutate is a mechanic from Ikoria, and we're including a lot of mutate creatures in this deck. They all have the ability mutate, and we'll get into that in a bit. I'd like to begin this episode by going through the main strategy for the deck. So aside from the mutate theme, where we are going to be mutating a lot of mutate creatures together, there's one strategy in the deck that allows us to really abuse Jegantha's ability. And the interaction is between Jegantha and two cards. And these cards are Pimp Aura and Freed from the Real. They both are enchant creatures that have this ability. You can pay a blue to untap enchanted creature. So if we ever have Jegantha out on board and we enchanted with either Freed from the Real or Pimp Aura, then we can tap Jegantha to float one mana of each color using this ability. We can then spend the blue floating from Jegantha to untap Jegantha. So now we've got an untapped Jegantha, and we are floating those 4 other colors, which can be only used to pay colored costs of cards. So we can do this as many times as we want. Tap, untap, and we essentially float in our mana pool infinite mana of every color other than blue, and it can only be spent to pay for colored costs. That is the same for both of these cards.
Music licensing reimagined.
So although the main deck's strategy is to play a lot of mutate creatures and go off with a stack of mutations, these two cards really accelerate the deck, and it puts it on another level when Jegantha is on the board enchanted by one of these two cards. So if we are floating so much mana that can only be spent to pay for colored costs on cards, there's a very specific type of card that we're looking for so that we can benefit from having so much colored mana, and those are ultimatums. So ultimatums are spells, sorceries that have only colored costs. So this is a fantastic way for us to dump this mana that we are generating to get insane amounts of value. So Violent Ultimatum, Eerie Ultimatum, and Ruinous Ultimatum, these all are free when we have these on board. If we don't have either of these enchanted Jegantha, these are still very easy to play because Jegantha will be paying for 3 of the icons just by tapping it. So these are the ones that are free when that is set up on board. And then because we are using the blue mana floating to untap Jegantha, we still have to pay the blue costs. So this one will essentially cost 3 blue to cast. This will cost 2 blue, and this will cost 2 blue, and that will cost 2 blue. So we have these very expensive, difficult to cast spells that we are getting for almost nothing. So incredible amounts of value, and especially with this interaction, we're able to cast it for very cheap and very early. So incredible amounts of value in all of these. Genesis Ultimatum, Inspired, Cruel Ultimatum, and then Emergent Ultimatum. This one I would just like to highlight because we pick 3 monocolored creatures in our deck, and then an opponent chooses 1 to shuffle back in our deck, and the other 2 we can cast for free. So 2 cards that are included in here which are insanely strong targets for that is Itali Primal Storm and Nezahal Primal Tide, and then any other strong monocolored mutate creature you'd like to get on the board. It makes it very difficult for your opponent to choose which one they don't want to fight. And then the last card that we can dump mana into is Dune Blast. So Jegantha will be paying these colored costs. So this effectively costs 4 of any color to destroy all creatures except one of your choice. So fantastic board clear, especially in here when we are cheating colored costs. Before we get into the mutate creatures, the main strategy of the deck and the theme of the deck, I'd just like to speak about the actual mutate mechanic, because it is quite a confusing mechanic that I feel a lot of people don't understand fully. And it can be very powerful when you utilize mutate in the correct way. So a mutate creature can either be cast for its normal casting cost or its mutate cost. If you cast it for its normal converted mana cost, you just pay the cost and you cast it as a creature spell, and then it'll enter the battlefield as that creature. If you cast it for its mutate cost, you pay the mutate cost, and then it has to have a creature as a target on board, so we will use Nezahal Primal Tide. It has to have a non-human creature as a target. You pay the mutate cost, and then this creature then mutates on top of or underneath that target creature. When they mutate, whichever one is at the top, that is the creature that exists with this power and toughness. However, it has all the abilities of all the creatures in the mutate stack. So we can mutate multiple creatures on, and it just keeps giving the creature at the top more and more abilities as you stack these mutated effects. With that being said, the more we mutate onto a single card, the more value we will get from each mutation. For example, Migratory Greathorn says, whenever this creature mutates, search your library for a basic land card, put it on the battlefield, and then shuffle. So every time we mutate onto this creature, we will ramp. So if we mutate Migratory Greathorn underneath Nezahal, because Nezahal is a fantastic mutate target, then we will ramp 1 land out of the deck. If we then mutate another creature on, let's take Dreamtail Heron for example, this says whenever it mutates, draw a card, and it has flying. So if we then mutate Dreamtail Heron onto this, but underneath, because we want the stats of the largest creature on the top, we now have a 7/7 with flying, and when we cast this, it'll trigger the mutate effects of both Migratory Greathorn and Dreamtail Heron. So we will draw a card, and we will get a land from our deck into play, and you can pick which order you want these to resolve. So as you can see, the more and more mutate creatures you put onto this mutated stack, the more value you can get per mutate that you cast. So the value can really get out of control, especially when we start cheating on mana costs and cheating more and more mutated cards out. And that is why this is so important. This combo of Jegantha and either of these enchantments, so we can effectively play a lot of the mutates for little to no cost. For example, Parcel Beast to mutate costs green-blue, so just with Jegantha on board, this is free, because we just tap the Jegantha for the green and blue. A lot of the mutate creatures that are multicolored, we can cast for little to no cost, because Jegantha will be paying for multiple of these color icons. So we get massive discounts on the cost from Jegantha in play, so we can play multiple mutates in the same turn, stacking up a mutate creature and getting multiple triggers of each mutate effect when we start making this stack. With that being said, I'd like to speak about another core card in the deck that really takes this deck's interactions with generating tons of mana and cheating out a lot of mutate cards to the next level. So Animar, Soul of Elements, we can cast this for free just with Jegantha on board. It's a 1/1 protection from white and black, so that is important to note because we cannot mutate white and black mutate creatures onto Animar because it cannot be targeted by that mutate creature as a mutate target. So only the other three colors, blue, red, green, can mutate onto here, which is fine because a lot of the creatures with mutate aren't black and white. Animar says, whenever you cast a creature spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Animar Soul of Elements. Creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each +1/+1 counter on Animar. So as we play creatures, cast creature spells, Animar gets +1/+1 counters, which then reduces the cost of our creature spells by 1 for each counter. So if we ever have Jegantha enchanted with Freed from the Real or Pimp Aura on board, we are firstly only paying the blue in the colored costs, and when Animar's on board, if we start stacking him up, eventually he'll get big enough that we don't pay any generic costs for our creatures. So when we have these on board and Animar's big enough, we can end up in a situation where we are only paying the blue costs of every single creature, and this gets absolutely outrageous. Because once effectively all our mutate creatures become free, aside for a few that have 1 or 2 blue icons, we can then cast mutate creature after mutate creature after mutate creature, which just gets us crazy value. So we already, let's say we're building the stack of mutate creatures. Now we've got this, if we have this set up on board, we effectively can start playing out these mutates for free, triggering this mutate stack, and every time we play one we get more and more value. So I find playing this deck, if you get to a certain point in the game, the deck's value just explodes, where no one can control what it does because it just plays everything for free. It can dig super hard, it can interact with the board, it can ramp, it just goes crazy, and I feel like people don't know that this interaction is possible. So now, to get into the mutate creatures we are playing almost all of them. Migratory Greathorn ramps, Dreamtail Heron draws, Parcel Beast lets us get lands from the top of our deck into play or draw, but that's only an activated ability, not triggered like mutate. Cloud Piercer can let us loot. Sea Dasher Octopus is nice because it can draw us if we are hitting directly with a creature that we can flash mutate onto, but being able to flash mutate is very strong because then we can trigger an entire mutate stack of creatures on our opponent's turns. We can trigger an entire stack of mutate creatures on our opponent's turns. Gem Razor can destroy artifacts and enchantments, so once we start stacking this mutate stack with different mutated creatures together, this can really pop off and wipe out all their artifacts and enchantments. Dirge Bat destroys creatures and planeswalkers. Pouncing Shore Shark returns creatures to its owner's hand. Chittering Harvester makes opponents sacrifice creatures. Archipelago can tap down our opponent's entire boards for multiple turns. Trumpeting Gnaw can fill our board with 3/3 beast tokens, making an extremely wide board. Cub Warden can fill our board with 1/1 lifelink cat creature tokens, making an even wider board. Glowstone Recluse gives reach and it allows us to start putting +1/+1 counters on our mutate creatures mutate stack, and those +1/+1 counters will stay at the top of the stack. So the creature with the power and toughness at the top will get the benefit from those +1/+1 counters. Same with Vulpikeet. Regal Leosaur is then a AoE board pump effect. So if we start generating tokens or have a lot of creatures out, this with multiple mutates can buff us up enough to end the game. Same with Huntmaster Liger, which buffs the buffs get bigger as this mutates more and more. Majestic Oricorn just gains us a bit of life. Porky Parrot can tap to deal damage equal to the number of times it's mutated. So if we enchant this with a massive stack of creatures with say Pimp Aura, then we can really do a lot of damage in a turn. Insatiable Hemophage can drain life from our opponents each time we mutate. Cavern Whisperer makes our opponents discard, which is quite an unfun one, but very strong effect. Auspicious Starix is absolutely incredible, and it is one of my favorite mutate cards. Whenever it mutates, you exile cards from the top of your library until you exile X permanent cards, where X is the number of times this is mutated, and then those permanents get put onto your battlefield for free. So the more you mutate on this, the more free permanents you get into play from the top of your deck. So it can really get your board state very massive very quickly. Lord Dracus can recur instants and sorceries. Necropanther recurs 3 or less cost creatures from the graveyard to the battlefield, so resurrect some of our smaller creatures. Boneyard Lurker can return permanents to our hand, so more graveyard recursion. Evercool Phoenix can make feathers that essentially bring it back from the grave if it dies. And then we're playing all 5 of the mythic mutate creatures. Vadrock lets us cast Vadrock lets us cast non-creatures that cost 3 or less from our grave for free. Snapdax does 4 damage to a creature or planeswalker an opponent controls, and we gain life, so a lot of damage and board control. Illuna is a very massive body, and whenever it mutates, you exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land permanent, and it goes into your hand or the battlefield. So similar to Auspicious Starix, where we will be cheating permanents into play, this just guarantees a non-land, whereas this can be a land. So very strong. Neithroy, this can resurrect multiple creatures from our graveyard when it mutates, so also insanely strong. And then Brokos, we can mutate from our graveyard, so we always have a way to activate our mutated stack of creatures. So we are playing a lot of mutate creatures, and once they start getting stacked up, we can start triggering all these abilities on every single cast. And we will hopefully be casting each of these for free, because we will hopefully have these set up, or at least this. But if we don't, because we can't assume to have any of these on board, just Jegantha lets us play multiple mutate creatures for very cheap from our hand every turn. So moving on, but not really, we are not actually finished with how mutate works. There's one other interaction I'd like to go into, which really can catch people by surprise if they don't know this ruling, and also can get you a massive board out of nowhere, seemingly nowhere. So if we ever have a stack of mutated creatures, so we've got a lot of mutated creatures all bunched together, then one interaction that a lot of people don't realize is that if you flicker that mutated creature, for example with Otherworldly Journey, we exile a creature. At the beginning of the next end step, we return it to the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter. If we target that mutate creature that has many mutations behind it, they will all exile, and then when this triggers at the end of the turn to return it back to its owner's control, all of those creatures that were on the stack come back onto the board separated as separate creatures. So just to show you, if we have these 4 creatures all mutated together and we cast Otherworldly Journey on this stack of creatures, they will all exile, and then at the beginning of the next end step they will come back into play all as separate creatures. So that can get us from having one creature that's, let's say, a 3/4 with a couple of mutated creatures behind, to immediately having a very wide board of mutate creatures that are all separate. This interaction is very important, not only because we can use flicker spells to set up a massive board to eliminate our opponents with a pump spell, but also because we can then protect our creatures. If we have a lot of creatures stacked together that have all mutated and it gets destroyed by one spell from an opponent, we lose all of those cards and they've spent one card to do it. So being able to flicker that and have them all come back separate not only protects all of our cards from a removal spell, but it also means that the removal spell that they will then want to use can only target one of those instead of all of them at once. So flicker is very important for the deck, and it allows us to really generate a lot of value out of both mutating creatures together and then getting a wide board for very low cost. So Otherworldly Journey to flicker a mutated creature is very good. Displace can do it to 2, so if we've got 1 stack for value and 1 stack for damage, we'll typically do both stacks together, but just to dilute risk, Displace can save both. And then Astral Drift is an enchantment, so we can pay 3 and cycle it to flicker something. But also if this is on the board as an enchantment, whenever we cycle another card, we can flicker something. So I'll get back to Astral Drift because we've got a sub-theme of cycling in the deck as well. And then lastly, Fires of Yavimaya gives all our creatures haste. Very strong in the deck because you can use it to both tap Jegantha immediately when we cast it, but also if we flicker a stack of mutated creatures, let's say with Displace, then they come back immediately, they cannot attack. But with Fires of Yavimaya on board, we can separate our mutated stack and then immediately attack with all of them and surprise our opponents with a very wide board out of nowhere. Another way of flickering our mutated creatures is by Nezahal. So Nezahal is a great card, but it's especially good in this deck because it gives us, firstly, it draws us a lot of cards, and then it allows us to discard 3 cards to exile it and return it to the battlefield tapped at the beginning of the next end step. So if we mutate creatures onto here, it is a non-human, so it's legal. Then if this gets targeted as the target of a destroy spell, we don't even have to have a flicker spell. We can simply discard 3 cards and it will exile itself with all the creatures, and they'll all come back separated because of Nezahal's own ability. So that is why Nezahal is also a star in this deck. One other win condition in this deck is also it's an infinite mana and infinite draw win combo, and that is with Leyweaver, Loreweaver. So depending on your play group, you can choose if you'd like to play these in the deck or not. This I play in the deck for games that are going on very long, people are struggling to close out, and this just simply wins the game. So if you cast either of these, they fetch the other one from your deck to your hand. And then if we enchant Leyweaver with Pimon's Aura or Freed from the Real, it gives us infinite mana because we're just spending blue to untap it, and it untaps 2 lands repeatedly. So we get infinite mana with this on board, and that gives us infinite draw when Loreweaver's on board, so we can draw our entire deck, and then we just combo off with all our mutated effects to deal damage to everyone and wipe them out. So depending on your play group, you can play these. I have them for those extra long games, but not essential, but also very fitting for the deck because of the synergies we are trying to achieve with mana cheating already. I'd just like to cover a few other key inclusions in the deck that just help bolster the deck in terms of defenses. So Softfoot Boots is great because we can give Hexproof and Haste to Jegantha, so it can tap immediately and is protected from our enemies' abilities and spells. Heroic Intervention can protect our permanents, giving them Hexproof and Indestructible. This is especially good because if we start mutating a lot of creatures together and we don't have a flicker spell, this will allow us to save all of them. And sometimes we won't necessarily want to flicker our stack of mutated creatures immediately because we still want to get more value out of it before we flicker and separate them. So very good for protecting our board as well as protecting our combos if we start setting up combos on board such as these. Teferi's Protection, another fantastic defense spell. It phases us out so our board can't be interacted with. Similar to Heroic Intervention, just a lot more powerful and also fantastic to protect our board. Garruk's Uprising is great because if we are fighting against a deck that is very wide with small creatures, when we flick our mutated stack out, this can firstly draw us a lot of cards, but secondly give us trample so we can punch through for the win. Polywog Symbiote makes our mutates cheaper and it lets us loot when we mutate, so very strong inclusion as well. Absent Charm is the only charm I've included. I've chosen to go for more ultimatums, but Absent Charm is really a great charm. Any of the charms you can include if you want to, because they are all free with Jegantha, but this one, to being able to draw or exile a creature, is really great. And then Karuga the Macrosage can be an insane draw spell, drawing 4 permanents that cost 3 or greater on our side of the board. And if we ever flicker a mutated stack and we play this, we are often going to draw upwards of 5 cards. So very powerful draw spell in this deck. Because this is a 5-color deck, ramping is very important. So we are obviously including Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, staples in Commander. They should be in every single one of your Commander decks. Rampant Growth for 2 mana can fetch us any land that we need. And then I've included 4 crystals from Ikoria. These all tap for 3 different colors, and although they cost 3, being able to mana fix is very good, and this additional effect of cycling is fantastic. And I don't know if you've noticed, but in terms of this Astral Drift, having available 4 ramp spells that we may not need later in the game turn into flicker spells can be very powerful and can save us from a detrimental kill spell. Then Skyshroud Claim and Circatus Roots both fetch 2 lands and are just fantastic for 5-color decks, because we can get lands that both might be dual or fix our mana, or both.
Music licensing reimagined.
And then last but not least, the mana base. We're playing Command Tower because it taps for 1 of any color. This is a staple and a very powerful card. Exotic Orchid taps for an opponent's color, so fantastic in 5-color decks because it often gets us whatever color we need. Evolving Wilds can mana fix. Myriad Landscape is a ramp land, fetching 2 of a land that we choose. And fetching blue with this is specifically good in the deck because then we can play more things for only paying the blue costs. Frontier Bivouac and Sandstep Citadel both enter tapped and tap for 3, so lands that fix our mana like this are really great in a 5-color deck. Cinderglade and Canopy Vista are both forests, so if we play Skyshroud Claim, we can fetch these 2 into play and get a wider variety of access to mana aside from just green after playing that card. These are also duels that can enter untapped. Caves of Koilos and Yavimaya Coast give us access to 4 different colors in just 2 lands, and sacrificing a little bit of life to do that is totally worth it. Temple of Malady and Temple of Mystery give us access to green, which is very good if we want to be ramping, because if we hit green early and we hit ramp, it'll often be green, so we can fetch more lands out, and being able to scry and manipulate the top is very strong. Temple of the False God gives us 2 mana, so we can spark out a more powerful play earlier in the game if it lines up. We are then playing 3 gates that cover all the colors with an additional blue, and that is so that when we play Circatus Roots, we can fetch any 2 gates that then cover the mana that we need for the next turn. And then we are playing 3 cycling lands, and these go in line with these 3 crystals. These all enter tapped, and we can use them as lands, or we can cycle them to draw if we don't need lands in the late game, or we can cycle them to flicker mutated creatures later as well. So Astral Drift is actually really fantastic in the deck. It seems like it would be underwhelming, but having this much access to cycling cards, we can get multiple flickers of just this one spell. And in addition, because it's a permanent, we can cheat it into play with some of the mutate effects when we start getting our synergies rolling. and then we are just playing a couple of basics of each color. That is it for episode 2, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. It has been awesome making and playing this deck. When these combos start going off and the mutate triggers and the stack starts popping off, the value is just incredible. It's so much fun to play, and I hope you guys had a blast watching this video and might try your own shenanigans with mutate in the future. I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers!